So what we're doing is our fifth lesson in image design, and to date we've spent the last four lessons on just looking at the frame and how we frame up a photograph, and we haven't actually got the point of working out what actually goes in the image, and that's where we're going to look at today. And this is going to take the rest of the series, is actually looking at the subject, and today we're going to look at where we place that subject without even looking at the contents of the subject, but just about placements of what goes where and why. So this is a subject position. And we're going to learn some of the background about this mythical concept of rule of thirds. And this is actually based on a mathematical theory, and I think it's fascinating. So if you don't like maths, and if you don't like learning where things actually come from, then probably go make a cup of tea. But I'll try and make it quick. But I found this really interesting. I'd heard about the rule of thirds, but finding out more about it is actually really interesting. So we're going to go into that. And we talked initially about how photography is one of the few arts that actually really engages the right and left brain. And I think that's why it appeals to so many of us, that we get to use that analytical side at the same time as we use the right side of our brain, which is the creative side. But right now, when we're talking about image design, we're actually in the creative side, but we also use that analytical side as well. And when we talk about the rule of thirds, we're really talking about design by numbers. This design by numbers was actually first written about in about 300 BC, where they talked about the aesthetic beauty of using what they called the golden ratio. And the golden ratio is a number. It's 1.618. And the Greeks and Romans and the Egyptians used these ratios of proportions of parts of a subject with respect to the whole subject. And they found if they could use the ratio of 1.6 for the different parts of a subject in the Parthenon and in the pyramids, they ended up with something that was aesthetically beautiful to humans. And that was always really mystifying for me, because, what was it? They found that when they did anything in this divine proportion, that people said, oh, that's beautiful. So when we use that proportion in size relationships, it aligns to people's perception of beauty. So that's the first thing. And you'll see, once you realize this concept of the golden ratio and phi equaling 1.6, you'll see it everywhere in things that just work. And it just works. In about the 12th century, a guy called Fibonacci, who was a mathematician, developed what he called the Fibonacci series. And what he found, these are like fairy dust. I said, when we were talking about how we made an amazing image, we added some fairy dust. Well, the fairy dust here are these series of numbers, because they're an amazing set of numbers and they combine in very unique ways. And one of those ways, if you take the ratio between any two consecutive numbers, you end up with phi. And Fibonacci worked with these numbers, and they are really a unique set of numbers. They add uniquely, they have consistent ratios. And I actually, as a programmer, used to use this Fibonacci series as a means of providing their additive uniqueness, for providing unique error messages. So I've used them both in biology and also in computing. But what Fibonacci did was realize that he could create what he called a golden rectangle by combining these numbers in a sequential way, that he could end up with the ratio of the rectangle being phi, 1.62, and each of these numbers, if they were occupying an area of space that was proportional to their size, could fit, and any of the series of the Fibonacci numbers, if you take any of the series, they fit in these sorts of ratios. But that's just mathematical. What they found is that if you can put any part of your subject, of your image, on any of the intersections of these, then you tended to have a stronger image. So it's all about the intersection of these aspects of this rectangle. And we go from that to the golden spiral. And you may have seen sometimes in overlays when you're cropping an image, you'll get either the golden spiral or the rule of thirds, or some of these other patterns that are created by how these numbers actually intersect as part of the rectangle. And so the golden spiral is something, if you go into cropping in both Photoshop and Lightroom and select options in your cropping guidance, you'll get the golden spiral. Now, why? Why do we use these? Why do we use these as guides for positioning our images and getting the ratios between different components of our images with respect to the exterior rectangle of our image? And what it comes from is that in nature, they've found these Fibonacci numbers are used in nature as ideal means of stacking information, like stacking subjects like seeds. Seeds and petals and branches on plants all use the Fibonacci numbers. So branches will divide into 2 and then divide into 3 and then divide into 5. And the way that seeds are actually allocated on pine cones and within sunflowers all use these golden spirals, and the Fibonacci numbers are how they're arranged within their circles. So what we believe is that humans have observed nature forever and have a innate love of nature and its beauty. And because nature assembles things with these sorts of ratios, not because it thinks it's beautiful, but because it's the most efficient way and most functional way of grouping things, are using these numbers. So in subconsciously observing nature, we absorb the idea that how nature does things is beautiful. And we therefore expect when we manufacture something to manufacture it in the same sort of way that nature does. And so that's why when we copy nature by positioning using these ratios and proportions, we make an image that is much more aesthetically beautiful. So I just went through my pictures of flowers and things and found the examples of these Fibonacci numbers being used in how petals are arranged within flowers, how leaves are arranged within succulents and cacti. The other thing that they've looked at is the human body and what's considered to be a beautifully aesthetic human body. And when these phi ratios, or the golden mean, or golden ratios, are used and applied to faces, what we think is the most aesthetically beautiful face satisfies these golden rectangles. And it's the same, even that 1.6 ratio is shown in our fingers in our hands, where each of the joints is, 1.6 in your fingers, greater than the previous, greater than the next joint up. So it's all over nature that we use these ratios because they're the ones that are the most functional. So we see them in shells, in the spirals that we see within mollusks, and we see them within the seed layouts of sunflowers and pine cones. So you can see the golden spiral there. And if you count the seed pods, they're all the Fibonacci numbers. And so it's very useful when we're cropping our images, and determining whether an image is actually a strong image is when we look at the overlay from cropping in Lightroom or Photoshop, and we apply either the rule of thirds grid or the golden spiral, we can see, yes, that's why I think this is a strong image. The central subjects within the image fall along that line and that curve. And if they don't quite make it, then adjust the crop until they do, and then you'll find it is actually a stronger image. So when we talk about the rule of thirds, it's almost an approximation of taking these concepts of the golden spiral and the golden rectangle and overlaying them on top of each other. And what we end up with is these intersections of these key points within the golden spiral. And that's our rule of thirds. We know that anything that sits on those intersections tends to be something that the eye will immediately go to, and something that we find more aesthetically pleasing. And also, if we're aligning up a horizon, we tend to put it either on the top third or on the bottom third. If we're lining up something vertical within an image, it always looks much better when it's sitting on one of those vertical thirds. Or if there's a single point subject in an image, it just aesthetically is more balanced if it sits on one of those intersections. So when we're actually looking through the grid finder in our camera, if we line up those intersections with the scene that we're seeing in front of us, we don't wait then until we're trying to crop it in Photoshop or Lightroom. We actually do that lining up for the most aesthetic positioning. And sometimes it is in the middle, the most aesthetic positioning, but usually we end up with a square crop when that's the case. But as a rule of thumb, use the rule of thirds, because as a first option, because it tends to give you the best image. If it's not working for you, then switch it up and try something else, but it is a really good guide. This is a photo that I took in Queenscliff at the weekend, and I was just trying to find an example for you, and I thought I've subconsciously used the rule of thirds. You know, where the hose attaches to the fire hydrant is right on that intersection point. The top of the fire hydrant sits on top of that part of the grid. The two vertical lines sort of come down the side of the fire hydrant, and they may not be exact, but it's a guide. And by using the guide, it gives you a more aesthetic image. This was another one I took with the wetlands at the weekend. So that strong horizontal component that is holding that grass needs to sit on one of those strong horizontal components that we consider to be a balanced image. And the tallest grass, the one that I've actually focused on, needs to sit on that vertical line. And so when you've got that grid finder up in front of you, position it so that you have got the best aesthetic, balanced image. And when you're reviewing your images for cropping, have a look at what you've got and think now how that, obviously the key component within this image is that fuchsia flower. It's where the eye goes to immediately. So when we look at the different crops overlays that we can get within Lightroom and within Photoshop, you can see each of those different crop outlays highlight the alignment to that golden rectangle and golden spiral and the rule of thirds. And if all of those confirm that the key components are lined up along where those intersections are, then that then confirms to you, yes, the crop I've actually got on this image is correct. So I often say to you with your cropping, it needs a little bit off the right-hand side. It just doesn't seem to be balanced. And when images are balanced, it's almost as if you put a pin in the middle, they would still sit. They wouldn't swing to one side. And so this is what this is doing, is just giving you guidance on how to make an image visually balanced. So when we were at the Buddha's stupa, I took this photo of one of the statues. I thought it was the most beautiful, elegant, carved hand. And that's how I took it, because that's how framing was. But then when I went to edit it, I needed to think about where was the, did it need more off that right-hand side? And so in terms of the intersection points of the rule of thirds, it did line up with the key parts of the photograph if I brought the crop down from the top and in from the left-hand side. Then having a look at the golden spiral, it spiraled around those two fingers, which are really important in terms of the gesture within this image. And one of the other crops they give you is this one for the intersecting points being located within those lines, and those lines being the angle of the image. And so by looking at each one of those overlays, then you could confirm, yes, that is actually the correct crop. And so when you're in crop in Lightroom, if you just keep hitting O, then you get these different overlays display. And if you're in the spiral overlay, if you hold down Shift and hit O, the spiral will go around different quadrants for you. So again, when I was cropping this image, that's how I cropped it, was actually looking how the butterflies fitted within the suggested overlays, which are based on the rule of thirds and the golden mean. I hope at the end of today you consciously think about, when you are actually taking a photograph, that you've always got that grid up in your camera, and that you align your key components within your subject to that grid. And then when you're back editing your photographs, have a look at the different overlays to confirm that you did get the crop right, or adjust the crop so it fits within that. And you'll find when you finish and hit OK for that crop, it actually ends up to be a stronger image as a result of it. What I'd like you to do is while you're editing the photos that you took recently, is review your crops and just see how they fit within each one of those overlays. Practice using your camera to do in-camera composition. Revise what we've done in the last few weeks with respect to framing, because in the last few weeks we've talked about whether you use a horizontal or a vertical framing for your images, and the different perspectives that you can get using both the lens length and also the point of view that you take, whether you shoot up or shoot down. So combining all of that, I'm expecting to see the output within next week's work.